The sickening crunch of thin wire and plastic, a sound utterly alien and horrifying, ripped through the quiet afternoon. It was followed by a choked, terrified squawk, then Leo's high-pitched scream, a sound that clawed its way directly into my heart and squeezed hard. I was on our small patio, reviewing a dense report on illegal pangolin scale, trafficking the mundane details of cruelty in a distant land, a stark contrast to the sun-drenched peace of our suburban backyard, or what had been peace seconds before. My head snapped up. The world seemed to tilt. Through the slats of the fence, separating our yard from Mrs. Henderson's meticulously manicured petunias, I saw a flash of violent movement. Then Karen Peterson's voice, sharp and venomous as a shard of glass. "Bird brain. Just like your ridiculous noisy creature, maybe this will teach you some quiet." I was moving before my brain fully processed the words, the report scattering unheeded on the flagstones. I vaulted the low fence, something my 40-something knees would protest later, but adrenaline is a powerful disregarder of future pain, and landed in a crouch on Mrs. Henderson's lawn. The scene that greeted me will be burned into my memory until the day I die. Leo, my sweet, sensitive 10-year-old son, was on his knees, hands clasped over his head. The bright blue parakeet cage, Pip's castle, was a mangled wreck crushed down over Leo's dark curls. Feathers tiny and iridescent blue floated in the air like tragic confetti. And Pip. Pip was a small, still shape amidst the twisted bars. Karen Peterson, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood decorum, stood over him, her face contorted in a mask of righteous fury, her chest heaving. In her hand, she still gripped a piece of the shattered cage base. For a frozen second, all I could hear was the ragged sound of Leo's sobbing, a desperate, heartbroken wail. Then my training, the ingrained calm of a federal wildlife crimes agent, accustomed to confronting poachers, traffickers, and the casual brutality of men who saw life only in terms of profit, deserted me entirely. This wasn't a case file. This was my son, my boy, Karen. My voice was a roar, raw and guttural, a sound I barely recognized as my own. She whirled, startled, the fury on her face, momentarily replaced by a flicker of, was it fear or just surprise at being challenged so directly? Agent Carter Ben. "What are you doing in Mrs. Henderson's yard?" she blustered, regaining her composure with unnerving speed. "Your son was... He was letting that bird make a racket again, and he was teasing my Mittens." Mittens, her overfed Persian cat, was nowhere in sight, likely cowering under a rosebush from the commotion. I ignored her, rushing to Leo, my hands shaking, as I so gently tried to lift the ruined cage from his head. "Leo, buddy, are you okay? Talk to me." He didn't respond with words, just a fresh torrent of sobs, his small body trembling like a leaf. There was a thin trickle of blood matting his hair near his temple, where a bent wire had scraped him. My stomach clenched. With extreme care, I disentangled the cage. Pip, his vibrant plumage dull, lay still. One tiny wing was bent at an unnatural angle. His chest was not moving. A wave of cold fury washed over me so intense it left me momentarily breathless. Pip wasn't just a pet. For Leo, whose autism made the chaotic signals of the human world a constant challenge, Pip was an anchor, a friend, a source of predictable, gentle comfort. His chirping was a rhythm in Leo's day, his playful antics a source of joy that needed no complex social interpretation. He killed Pip. Leo finally choked out, his voice thick with devastation, his eyes wide and swimming with tears fixed on the lifeless bird. He reached out, a trembling finger stroking a feather. Karen scoffed, though a hint of uncertainty now tinged her bravado. "Oh, for heaven's sake, it's just a bird, and it was probably diseased anyway, making all that noise. I did you a favor, and your son needs to learn to control himself and his pets." A favor. My voice was dangerously low. I carefully scooped Pip's small, warm body into my hand. The delicate bones felt fragile, broken. "You assaulted my son, Karen. You destroyed his property, and you killed his companion animal. In front of him. Assaulted." She laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't be so melodramatic, Ben. It was a light tap. He's tougher than he looks. Or he should be. And it's hardly destruction of property for a cheap birdcage. As for the bird, it was a nuisance. I'm sure the HOA bylaws have something to say about noisy pets. I rose slowly to my full height, Pip cradled in one hand, the other, instinctively going to where my badge would be if I were on duty, a familiar grounding gesture. My mind was racing, toggling between the raw protective rage of a father and the cold, analytical focus of an agent. Assault on a disabled minor. Cruelty to animals, specifically the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or potentially other federal statutes depending on Pip's exact species and origin. Though parakeets themselves weren't federally protected, wild species in this context, the act of cruelty could still have repercussions, and state laws were robust. But the assault on Leo that was immediate and undeniable. Karen, I said, my voice devoid of the heat. I felt replaced by an icy precision that I knew from long experience was far more intimidating. You have no idea the depths of trouble you've just stepped into. Mrs. Henderson. I called out, my voice carrying to the Hendersons' back porch, where I now saw the elderly woman peering out, her face a mask of shock. Did you see what happened? Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman who often left little birdseed treats for Pip on the fence line, nodded, her hand fluttering to her mouth. I saw it all, Ben. She hit him with the cage. And the poor little bird. Her voice trailed off, filled with distress. Karen Peterson. I stated, my gaze locking onto hers. You are not to leave. I am placing you under citizen's arrest for assault, pending the arrival of local law enforcement. And I will be pursuing federal charges related to animal cruelty, depending on the full circumstances we uncover. Do you understand? Her jaw dropped. Citizen's arrest. Federal charges. Are you insane? You can't do that. I'm the HOA president. Your title is irrelevant to the law, Karen, I said, pulling out my phone with my free hand. My other hand still gently held Pip. And yes, I can, and I will. As I dialed 911, I met her gaze. She looked for the first time genuinely afraid. The self-righteous bully was starting to realize she'd picked a fight with someone who knew exactly how to make her accountable, not just for her cruelty, but under the full weight of the laws she clearly thought didn't apply to her. The fight for Leo and for Pip had just begun. The wail of approaching sirens was a counterpoint to Leo's quiet, hiccuping sobs as Emily, my wife, burst through the back gate, her face a mask of terror. She'd heard the commotion from inside the house. One look at Leo, at the mangled cage, at my grim expression, and she understood. She rushed to Leo, enveloping him in a hug, murmuring soothing words, her eyes flashing pure, unadulterated fury at Karen Peterson, who now stood frozen, a strange mottled flush rising on her neck. The local police officers, a young man and a more seasoned woman, arrived quickly. They listened patiently, their expressions growing more serious as I recounted what happened, corroborated by a tearful Mrs. Henderson. Leo, bless his heart, was still mostly nonverbal, clinging to Emily, but his distress was palpable evidence. Pip's tiny body, which I had carefully placed in a small clean cloth I'd retrieved from our house, was examined with a gentleness that I appreciated. She called him Bird Brain. Leo whispered suddenly to Emily, his voice barely audible but clear enough for the officers to hear. She said Pip was stupid. Pip wasn't stupid. He knew tricks. He said, "Hello, sunshine." His lower lip trembled violently. The female officer, Sergeant Miller, no relation thankfully, looked at Karen Peterson, her gaze hardening. Ms. Peterson, based on the statements and the visible injury to the child, not to mention the deceased animal, we are taking you into custody for assault and battery and for animal cruelty under state statutes. You have the right to remain silent. As Sergeant Miller read Karen her rights, Karen seemed to deflate. The bluster, the arrogance, it all leached away, leaving behind a rather ordinary, pinched-looking woman who suddenly seemed to understand the gravity of her actions, or at least the gravity of her consequences. "This is a misunderstanding," Karen cried, her voice cracking. I lost my temper. That bird, it's always chirping, and he just stares. It's unnerving. Ma'am, unnerving is not a legal defense for assault or for killing a pet, Sergeant Miller said dryly, taking her arm. The younger officer retrieved the cage and the cloth-wrapped Pip as evidence. Watching Karen Peterson being led away in a police car, her perfectly coiffed hair slightly askew her face, a rictus of disbelief and indignation, provided a grim sort of satisfaction, but it was a hollow victory. The real work was just beginning. Leo was traumatized. Pip was dead, and the system, as I knew all too well, could be slow and frustrating. Emily took Leo inside, settling him on the sofa with his weighted blanket. His favorite soft toy, a plush manatee named Manny, was clutched in his arms. His eyes were red-rimmed and unfocused, staring at the spot where Pip's cage usually hung by the window. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and Leo's occasional shuddering breath. "I need to make some calls," I told Emily quietly, my voice still hoarse. "My office. We need to document this from a federal perspective too, even if it's primarily a state matter for the animal. There might be Lacey Act implications if she's been trapping or illegally sourcing other animals. People like her. This is rarely an isolated incident of cruelty." Emily nodded, her own eyes, filled with a mixture of grief and anger. "Do whatever you have to do, Ben. She needs to pay for this. For what she did to Leo. For Pip." My first call was to Dr. Evans, Leo's pediatrician, to get him checked out. The cut on his head was superficial, but I was more worried about the emotional fallout. Then I called my supervisor at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Special Agent in charge, Tom McAndrew. "Tom," I said, "I've got a situation. Personal, but it's crossing into professional territory. Or rather, I'm about to drag it there." I explained the events, my voice tight with controlled emotion. Tom, a gruff, pragmatic man who'd seen it all, listened without interruption. "Damn, Ben, your boy okay? Physically, he'll heal. Emotionally, it's going to be a long road. Pip was his world, and she called him Bird Brain Tom while she was doing it." A heavy sigh came down the line. "Some people are just poison, Ben. Pure poison." "Okay, state has the lead on the assault and the local animal cruelty, but you're right to be suspicious. This level of casual, vicious cruelty towards an animal, especially in front of a child, often isn't a one-off. Dig, see if she has a history, any exotic pets, any unusual bird feeders that might be traps. Neighbors notice anything, you know the drill. If there's a federal hook, we'll nail her to the wall with it. In the meantime, I'll make sure the local DA knows you're one of ours and that the USFWS has an interest in Ms. Peterson's animal-related activities. Might make them take the state charges even more seriously." "Thanks, Tom. That's what I needed to hear." The setup of our lives, the carefully constructed routines that gave Leo stability, felt shattered. Our home, in the quiet, leafy subdivision of Willow Creek Glen, had always been a sanctuary. Leo had his specific spot on the couch, his predictable meal times, his afternoon ritual of talking to Pip, telling him about his day at the special school he attended, or about the fascinating patterns he'd found in the leaves. Pip would chirp back, tilting his head, a tiny feathered confidant. Now, an empty hook hung by the window, a constant, painful reminder. Before this, Karen Peterson had been a background irritant. The HOA meetings she ran were exercises in pedantry, her pronouncements on lawn-length recycling bin placement, and the appropriate holiday decorations delivered with an air of unshakable authority. We'd had a few minor run-ins. She'd complained once about the unnatural brightness of the solar-powered fairy lights Emily had strung along our porch, railing lights Leo loved to watch. Another time, she'd left a passive-aggressive note about Leo's quiet humming when he was in the yard, suggesting it might disturb those seeking quiet enjoyment of their property. Each time I dealt with it calmly, professionally, citing our right to reasonable enjoyment and pointing out the lack of any actual bylaw infringement. I dismissed her as a petty tyrant, a lonely woman, compensating for a lack of control elsewhere in her life. I had grossly underestimated her capacity for cruelty. The next few days were a blur of medical appointments for Leo, interviews with detectives, and the grim task of helping Leo process his grief. He drew pictures of Pip, pages and pages of them, sometimes flying free, sometimes lying still. He asked repeatedly why Karen had been so mean. Did Pip sing too loud, Daddy? Was I too noisy for her ears? Each question was a fresh stab to my heart. No buddy, I'd say, hugging him tight. Pip sang beautifully, and you have every right to make happy noises. Karen was wrong. What she did was cruel, and it was against the law. And people who break the law, especially when they hurt children or animals, have to face consequences. The initial investigation by local PD confirmed Mrs. Henderson's account. Other neighbors, when pressed, admitted Karen had a history of aggressive complaints about pets and children. One recalled her trapping a squirrel that had dared to raid her bird feeder, not one of the humane traps, but a lethal snap trap left baited near a path children used. She dismissed it as pest control. Meanwhile, I started my own quieter investigation into Karen Peterson. Using public records and some discreet inquiries through USFWS channels, I began to build a profile. She was divorced, no children, moved to Willow Creek Glen about 5 years ago after selling a much larger property in a more rural county. No obvious federal flags initially, but the incident with the squirrel trap nagged at me. It showed a callous disregard for animal suffering and potential endangerment of others. The first escalation from Karen's side came swiftly. Her lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Alistair Finch, known for his aggressive defense of well-heeled clients, issued a statement to the local paper. It painted Karen as the victim, a dedicated community volunteer who had been provoked by an out-of-control child and a persistently noisy animal and was now being unfairly targeted by a federal agent using his position to pursue a personal vendetta. Finch demanded the charges be dropped and hinted at a countersuit for defamation and harassment. He's trying to muddy the waters, create doubt, I told Emily, crumpling the newspaper. Standard playbook. Will it work? She asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Not if the truth has anything to say about it, and I'm going to make sure it speaks loud and clear. Then came the anonymous calls to Child Protective Services. Suddenly, our care for Leo was under scrutiny. A caseworker, a tired-looking woman named Ms. Davies, visited our home. We showed her Leo's room, his therapy schedules, his school reports, the loving, supportive environment we'd painstakingly built for him. Leo thankfully was calm during the visit, even showing Ms. Davies one of his drawings of Pip, Miss Davies left clearly satisfied there was no case, but the experience was demeaning and infuriating. It was Karen through Finch, trying to weaponize Leo's autism against us. She's trying to break us, Emily said, her voice trembling with rage after Ms. Davies departed. She's trying to say we're the bad parents. And she's failing, I said, pulling her close. We know who we are. We know how much we love Leo. This is just noise. We focus on Leo. And I focus on making sure Karen Peterson never hurts anyone again. The second shocking incident in the rising action unfolded a week later. Leo had been reluctant to go into the backyard, the scene of his trauma. We'd been encouraging him with short, supervised visits. One afternoon, he was finally feeling brave enough to sit on the grass with his drawing pad. I was watching from the kitchen window. Karen Peterson, out on bail and clearly feeling emboldened by Finch's aggressive tactics, was in her own yard, separated from ours by a tall wooden fence. Suddenly, a series of incredibly loud bangs, like a nail gun firing, rapidly erupted from her side of the fence, accompanied by high-pitched shrieks from what sounded like a bird distress call recording. Leo leaped to his feet, hands over his ears, his face a mask of terror. He stumbled backwards, tripping and falling, then scrambled towards the house, screaming. I was out there in a second. Karen, I yelled, banging on the fence. What in God's name do you think you're doing? The noise stopped. Her voice, laced with saccharine innocence, floated over the fence. Oh, hello, Agent Carter. Just doing a bit of home repair and trying out a new bird scarer. Pigeons, you know. Such a mess. You know that terrifies him. You're doing this deliberately. I have no idea what you're talking about, she cooed. I'm simply maintaining my property. Surely the HOA president is allowed to do that. This was calculated cruelty, psychological warfare waged against a traumatized child. My blood boiled. I documented the incident meticulously. Date, time, nature of the sounds, Leo's reaction. I even managed to get a snippet of the bird distress call on my phone's recorder before she shut it off. This wasn't just about Pip anymore. This was about a sustained campaign of harassment and intimidation against a disabled child, a clear attempt to deprive him of the peaceful enjoyment of his own home. I added it to the file. I was building a file that was getting thicker by the day. My investigation into Karen's background began to yield something more concrete. The property she'd sold in rural Benton County. It was unusually large, with several outbuildings. Neighbors there had been interviewed at the time of her move by a local reporter doing a changing community piece. One had mentioned offhand Karen's unusual pets and her frequent trips to bird shows and swaps. Bird shows, that pinged. Many are legitimate, but some are notorious gray markets for illegally caught or smuggled birds. I requested satellite imagery of her old Benton County property through USFWS resources. The resolution was good enough to show what looked like several large aviaries partially hidden by trees not visible from the road. Interesting. Why would someone need so many large concealed aviaries if they weren't breeding commercially or collecting on a grand, possibly illicit scale? The midpoint twist arrived in a plain manila envelope addressed to me at my USFWS office, no return address. Inside was a USB stick. My heart pounded as I inserted it into my secure work computer. It contained a series of photographs and short video clips. The photos were of Karen Peterson, younger but unmistakable at various bird markets, some known hotspots for illegal trade. In several, she was handling birds that looked suspiciously like protected native species. Finches, buntings, even a glimpse of what might have been a painted redstart. The videos were shakier, clearly taken covertly. One showed her in what looked like a large, cluttered outbuilding rows of small cages, lining the walls, many containing wild-caught birds. Another showed a brief, heated exchange with an unseen man over the price of a cage full of what looked like indigo buntings. The audio was poor, but I could make out her saying, "They're freshly caught, worth twice that. No bans, no records." My breath caught. This wasn't just suspicion. This was evidence. Potential violations of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Lacey Act for interstate trafficking of illegally taken wildlife. This was my world. This was the kind of case I lived for. Karen Peterson wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was potentially a small-time but dedicated illegal wildlife trafficker specializing in native songbirds. The cruelty to Pip the squirrel, her attempts to terrorize Leo with bird distress calls, it all clicked into a much darker, more disturbing pattern. Her obsession with birds wasn't admiration, it was possession, control, and profit. The bird brain comment to Leo now felt even more sinister, a projection of her own twisted relationship with these creatures. I immediately called Agent Sarah Chen, a sharp, resourceful colleague who specialized in digital forensics and tracking illegal online wildlife sales. "Sarah, I've got something. It might be big. I need you to help me trace the origin of these files and see if you can find any online chatter, any sales and deeds advertisements that match this MO from the last 10 years. Sarah was intrigued. Songbirds. It's a nasty trade. Small birds, big suffering, often overlooked. Send it over, Ben. Let's see what your HOA queen has been hiding. The upcoming HOA disciplinary hearing for Karen, initiated by the board after the assault on Leo, was now a much bigger deal. They were planning to remove her as president based on conduct unbecoming. But with this new evidence, I realized we had leverage for something far more significant. The week leading up to the hearing was fraught with tension. Finch was in overdrive filing motions to have the HOA hearing postponed, claiming bias, lack of due process. He even tried to get a gag order on me, which the judge summarily dismissed. Emily and I focused on Leo trying to keep his routine as normal as possible, but the strain was visible. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and the empty space where Pip's cage hung was a constant, silent accusation. The night of the HOA hearing, the community center meeting room was packed to the rafters. Word had spread. This wasn't just about bylaws anymore. It was about justice for Leo, for Pip, and for a community that had lived under Karen Peterson's oppressive thumb for too long. I saw Mrs. Henderson in the front row, her expression determined. Other familiar faces, neighbors who had previously stayed silent, now looked on with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Karen Peterson swept in with Finch, attempting an air of defiant confidence, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. The HOA board members, a nervous-looking accountant named Gerald, a stern former librarian named Ms. Albright, and a pragmatic engineer, David Lee, sat at the head table looking grim. The hearing began. David Lee, the acting president, outlined the charges conduct detrimental to the community harassment and the assault that led to criminal charges. Finch immediately launched into a florid defense painting Karen as a misunderstood public servant, a victim of a vendetta. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice calm, my emotions tightly leashed. I recounted the assault on Leo, the killing of Pip, Karen's subsequent harassment, using the recorded bird calls. I described the impact on my son, his fear, his grief, his loss of security in his own home. The room was silent, save for a few empathetic gasps. This is not about bylaws, I concluded. This is about basic human decency. It's about protecting the vulnerable. It's about ensuring that no child, no animal in our community is subjected to such cruelty and malice. Finch jumped up. These are baseless allegations. Agent Carter is using his federal position to intimidate this board. There is no credible evidence, only his emotional biased testimony. On the contrary, Mr. Finch, I said, my voice dropping slightly, signaling a shift. There is evidence, significant evidence, not just of the assault for which Ms. Peterson is already facing criminal trial, but of a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond neighborhood disputes. I nodded to Sarah Chen, who I'd asked to attend, and to two uniformed USFWS enforcement officers who had discreetly entered and now stood at the back of the room. The air crackled with anticipation. "Ms. Peterson," I said, turning to her, "we have reason to believe that your interest in birds extends beyond mere appreciation. We have evidence suggesting your involvement in the illegal trapping and trafficking of protected native songbirds, a violation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Lacey Act." Karen's face went ashen. Finch looked like he'd been poleaxed. "This is an ambush." In outrage, he spluttered, "You can't bring this up here. This is an HOA hearing." "Actually, Mr. Finch," Sarah Chen said, stepping forward, her voice cool and authoritative, "we can, and we are. Based on evidence obtained by our office, including photographic and video material, and corroborated by financial records showing undeclared income consistent with illegal wildlife sales, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is today charging Karen Peterson with multiple counts of violating federal wildlife laws." The two uniformed USFWS officers began to advance. The climax was here. This evidence, Sarah continued, her voice cutting through Finch's protests, also suggests that Ms. Peterson's outbuildings at her previous property in Benton County were used to house illegally trapped birds, and that she has continued these activities on a smaller scale here in Willow Creek Glen using her current residence. She held up a small, innocuous-looking bird feeder I'd photographed in Karen's backyard, a model often modified by trappers. This, for instance, is a modified trap feeder illegal to use for protected species. Karen stared, her mouth opening and closing like a beached fish. The fight drained out of her. She looked small, pathetic, her carefully constructed facade of HOA power and respectability crumbling into dust. One of the USFWS officers formally addressed her. "Karen Peterson, you are under arrest for violations of federal wildlife statutes. You have the right to remain silent." As they cuffed her, a stunned silence filled the room, then a wave of murmurs of shock, of dawning understanding. This was bigger than anyone had imagined. The HOA queen wasn't just a bully, she was a federal criminal. The falling action was swift and decisive. Karen Peterson, facing overwhelming evidence on both the state assault charges and the federal wildlife crimes, had little room to maneuver. The contents of the USB stick, authenticated by Sarah Chen's team, were damning. A warranted search of her current home, which I had to recuse myself from participating in directly, despite my burning desire to do so, uncovered several illegally trapped native finches hidden in a back room, along with trapping equipment and detailed ledgers of sales going back years. Her pest control excuse for the squirrel trap now looked like part of a larger pattern of disregard for animal welfare when it inconvenienced her. The HOA board voted unanimously to permanently remove her as president and ban her from holding any future office. They also began a review of all bylaws she had unilaterally pushed, through many of which were found to be overly punitive or arbitrarily enforced. David Lee was elected the new president, promising transparency and a focus on community, not control. Legally, Karen Peterson was facing a firestorm. Her lawyer, Alistair Finch, seeing the mountain of evidence, particularly the federal charges, which carried stiff penalties, including significant prison time and hefty fines, quickly shifted from aggressive denial to damage control. He attempted to negotiate a plea bargain. The U.S. Attorney's Office, working with the local DA, was unyielding on the core charges. They wanted to make an example of her, especially given the cruelty to a child with disabilities and the brazen nature of her illegal wildlife activities. Leo's healing was a slower, more personal process. He started therapy with Dr. Ramirez, a wonderful child psychologist who specialized in trauma and autism. They used play therapy, art, and storytelling to help Leo process his fear and grief. He drew fewer pictures of Pip lying still and more of him flying in a bright blue sky, sometimes with other birds. He started talking about Pip's funny habits, a tentative smile gracing his lips. The raw pain was slowly, painstakingly being overlaid with fond memories. The community of Willow Creek Glen, shocked into awareness, began to change. Neighbors started talking to each other more, organizing block parties, looking out for one another. Mrs. Henderson became a local hero for her bravery in speaking out. Several neighbors who had also suffered under Karen's reign of petty rules came forward to apologize to us for not speaking up sooner, their guilt palpable. We assured them we understood. Fear can be a powerful silencer. A few months later, at the combined sentencing hearing, Karen had pleaded guilty to assault on a minor felony animal cruelty under state law, and several counts of violating the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to avoid a protracted trial, the judge delivered his verdict. He spoke scathingly of her calculated cruelty towards Leo, her abuse of power in the HOA, and her callous exploitation of protected wildlife for profit. Karen Peterson was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, followed by a lengthy probation, during which she was forbidden from owning any animals or holding any position of authority in any community association. She was also ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution for Leo's therapy and for the veterinary costs. Though Pip could not be saved, the necropsy to confirm cause of death for the cruelty case was a cost. Her assets, including her house in Willow Creek Glen, were subject to seizure to cover these amounts. The resolution wasn't just about punishment, though. It was about restoration. David Lee and the new HOA board organized a community rebuilding day. Neighbors volunteered to repaint faded fences, plant a communal flower garden near the entrance of the subdivision, and install a beautiful new bird bath and several responsibly designed feeders in the small parquet, far from Karen's old house. One of the most touching moments for us was when a delegation of neighbors led by Mrs. Henderson came to our door. They presented Leo with a gift, a new sturdy bird cage, and inside 2 small cheerful zebra finches, a species known for their gentle nature and resilience. They were captive bred, of course, with all the proper documentation. Leo's eyes, when he saw them, lit up with a brilliance I hadn't seen since before the attack. He was hesitant at first, but the tiny birds, with their soft chirps and busy movements, quickly won him over. He named them Pip, Thekanu, and Sunny. Watching Leo later that day, sitting by the window, softly talking to his new feathered friends, a sense of profound peace settled over me. The scars on his heart would take time to fully fade, but the light, the joy, was returning. The empty hook by the window now held a new cage, a symbol not of loss, but of resilience, of community kindness, and of the enduring power of a gentle spirit. The fight had been arduous, personally and professionally. It had tested my limits as a father and as an agent. But seeing Leo smile, hearing the happy chatter of his new birds, witnessing the positive changes in our neighborhood, it was all worth it. Justice in its many forms had finally come to Willow Creek Glen, and the loudest sound in our backyard now was not the echo of cruelty, but the sweet, untroubled song of birds, and the even sweeter sound of my son's quiet laughter. The memory of Pip would always be cherished, a reminder of innocence lost, but also of the love that endured and the strength found in standing up against the darkness, no matter how ordinary its disguise.